It's so good to be together, to gather together, to see you all. I know most of you, but I'm Rabbi Jill Maderer, for those who I haven't yet had the pleasure to meet. And we'd like to just get started. It's Rosh Shalom, so we're starting on time, right? So first of all, a welcome to our guests, to Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, to all of you who are new to Rosh Shalom. Raise your hand if you're not a part of the congregation and just here as a guest. So nice to have you here. Welcome. Is that Rabbi Friedman raising his hand? I think you're a couple years beyond that. So such profound gratitude to our past president, Rick Berkman, who has generously made this evening possible and makes so much possible. We wholeheartedly trust Rick's vision when it comes to Israel education, so much so that he teaches our Israel class. And so we all really recommend that course as well. Thank you to the Shalom Hartman Institute for working with us on making tonight possible as well. And thank you to our Israel Connectors chair, Ned Hanover. Where's Ned? Maybe could you just stand, because people may want to deepen their involvement, and this is the person to speak with. And to Lynn Edelman and Elaine Crane for having, I see Lynn back there, and Elaine I know is with us in spirit tonight, and so much hard work from your hands. So thank you to both of you. And thank you to the JCRC at the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia and the American Jewish Committee for co-sponsoring tonight, and I see some friends from there as well. As we like to do at Rosh Shalom, we do want to be sure in all opportunities, but especially when talking about difficult things, about things that so deeply matter to us, we want to be sure to be among community. And so before I invite you to turn around and find someone new to meet, I'm actually going to send you to not only introduce yourself by name, but also to consider a question that you might respond to. And here's that question. I'm thinking about tonight's focus and what it means to be marking now nearly 1 year, and how time can just be a strange thing. And so I wonder if we might take a moment to reflect to ourselves, does it feel like 1 year? And perhaps when you turn around and find someone new to greet, in addition to sharing your name, you might just share, does it feel like 1 year? It can be a yes or no question or a half of a sentence or so, and we'll keep it brief. I know you could talk all night about the topic, but we're going to listen for a lot more of the night. So just maybe take a breath for 10 seconds and reflect. And now let's turn around and or get up and walk around, find someone new to greet, and share your response.
I can make it work. Just tell me when it's time.
Okay, I can help bring them back together.
Okay, fine.
I know I sort of caused trouble when I did. All right, we're going to just finish that thought. Let's just finish that sentence. And I'll invite you to go ahead and find your seat as we come back together.
Thank you all for coming on a Tuesday evening. I'm really looking forward to this. I'm going to just do two things briefly. I'm going to introduce a little bit about the Sholem Hartman Institute so you know about it, and then I'm going to introduce Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer so you know about him, and then we'll all learn from him. I spent 10 summers at the Sholem Hartman Institute and got to know Dr. Kurtzer and others there over those 10-day summers. Learned a lot. I then participated in their I Engage programs that are wonderful video lectures, video roundtables, and course material for people interested in learning about the relationship of Israeli Jews to diaspora American Jews. And some of you participated in some of my courses together and apart or together and separate. And the more recent one I'm teaching now, Milestones in Israel History and Their Meaning. So what that involves, and several of you have started, we started this Sunday, and any of you are welcome, is focusing on the Balfour Declaration of 1917 and how it changed our perception as Jews of a homeland for the Jewish people, the 1947 UN partition plan and how it changed our understanding of actually the formation of a Jewish state, maybe even a two-state solution that didn't come about, and then the events of 1967 that changed a large number of American Jews' perception of Israel as the underdog David who survived in the Six-Day War, and also changed the Israelis' views of themselves. And as I said, the fourth milestone is not in the course, but hopefully tonight Yehuda will tell us something about how the events of October 7th, 2023 has changed our perception and Israelis' perceptions of themselves, of Jewish peoplehood, of the role of Zionism moving forward. I urge you all to go to the webpage for the Sholem Hartman Institute for three reasons. You will find there something called Ideas for Today that gets published probably every week. And in it are podcasts worth listening to, one called For Heaven's Sake, which is a podcast between Danielle Hartman and Yossi Klein Halevi about all the very difficult ethical issues resulting from the Gaza war. And the other is Yehuda's terrific series called Identity Crisis. You can go back for weeks and years in some of these cases and hear these great people talk about the really hard issues of what it means to develop and evolve as a evolving sense of Zionism, a liberal Zionism, and how American and other diaspora communities may relate to them. So I do urge you to go listen to those. You'll appreciate them. Now, about Dr. Kurtzer. He is now the president of the Sholem Hartman Institute. He's perceived by lots of people to be not only a leading thinker, but writer in the area of peoplehood, Jewish peoplehood, and its relationship to Zionism and the ideas of Zionism and the evolution of Zionism, as well as the difference between pure history, even though he has a lot of historical background, history background, and how we pass on memory, how we think about events as a part of memory. He's also written a lot and taught a lot on Jewish communal life, innovation and leadership in Jewish communal life. He held the first chair at Brandeis University of the Jewish Communal Innovation Chair, and he works with people like us and leaders. They teach a course at Hartman for Jewish leaders every summer. They teach courses for rabbis of all denominations. Just in a little aside, they helped write, one of their scholars helped write the Code of Ethics for the Israeli Defense Forces, and they teach every officer in the Israeli Defense Forces comes to Hartman for a period of study to study the Code of Ethics. So they really have a real impact there. But he went to Brown University, got his master's in religious studies, and then went to Harvard and got his PhD in Jewish religious studies. He's been part of the Wexner Fellows, and he's just been a great thought provoker, thought leader who makes us think deeply about some of the problems of dealing with our own identities and our identities vis-a-vis Jewish peoplehood around the world, and Israel in particular. So with that, I'm going to introduce him and then let him tell us about how October 7th has affected Israel and our own perceptions of ourselves, and how Israel may evolve into the future and how we may evolve into the future. Dr. Kurtzer.
Okay, so I'm going to probably get rid of this one. Can you hear me okay in this mic? Yes? Okay. So good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thank you, Rabbi Mederer. Thank you, Rick, great friend of the Institute. And thanks to all of you for being here tonight. It's going to be a hard subject. Just telling you in advance, everything that I've talked about since October 7th has been a hard subject, and it's not going to get any easier. And I want to start with a confession of sorts. I've been dreading this anniversary of October 7th for quite some time now, and not just for the obvious reasons of the ways that when you re-enter hard, painful memories, it evokes all of those emotions and sentiments from those first difficult minutes, hours, days, and weeks following this immense trauma in Jewish life, and a trauma which then invited a whole series of continuing traumas and continuing moral, political dilemmas for the state of Israel and the Jewish people. I've been dreading it beyond what the memories it brings back, because of what Rick alluded to, something I've thought about for a long time, the difference between what we call Jewish history, the chronicle of events that happens to us, and this business of Jewish memory, knowing that the latter, Jewish memory, has always been the thing that's kept the Jewish people going. We are a people who tells a very spotty version of our history, but we've told the version of history that translates into meaning and obligation. And I'm really worried about the meanings that we have to start deriving now out of events that are so recently in our past. And you don't really have a choice. You have to commemorate. You have to mark these events. You have to translate them into meaning and to ritual. My colleagues at Hartman have been writing a whole bunch of resource guides for rabbis and community leaders on how to mark ritually the events of October 7th. I don't know what it means to take a holiday as joyful as Simchat Torah, which is literally now bloodstained for the Jewish people for a long time. I don't quite know what to do with that. And I've been dreading this. But I guess the other reason why I feel I've been dreading this is because I feel like the last year has involved a lot of what I would call, for many of us in this work, pastoral Torah. How do we hold our people together through a period of suffering? How do we identify together with the Jewish people, not only as victims of October 7th, but as Zionists and Jews trying to stay in relationship to the complicated work of Israel fighting this complicated war? And I will say perversely, I have liked that space of the pastoral. And part of the reason I'm dreading the shift, moving to something else, is because it is time for us to not only hold and process the meaning of what happened to us, but it is time for us to start a forward-thinking moral conversation about what the Jewish people do now. Tonight's not going to be easy, right? I'm not going to spend most of our time reflecting on the past year. I want to set an agenda for what I think the next year or couple of years should look like as our people moves beyond the one-year anniversary of October 7th. To do this, I want to engage in a little bit of a thought exercise. I want you to consider a time, a moment, not a macroeconomic moment of the Jewish people, but something in your own lives, a moment when somebody did something really bad to you that you feel you didn't deserve. Somebody did something really bad to you that you feel you didn't deserve. The first level, the most natural human level, is processing the pain or the suffering of what that person did to you, right? Just dealing with that. That's the kind of triage level, accounting for the pain, the suffering, even the anger, right, of what was done to you. The second layer is, and this is, I think, common, you start processing a whole bunch of other layers that have been brought about not by something you did, by something someone else did to you. Maybe you feel some sort of guilt, and then worse than guilt is shame, right? Shame is our moral processing of guilt and turn it into something that can feel very heavy. Did I do something? Did I have to start questioning the legitimacy of my own actions compared to someone else? You might even find yourself in a place that's even deeper than guilt or shame, a phenomenon that Professor Jill Stouffer of Haverford College calls ethical loneliness, which is the experience of being victimized in one way and then not being believed. This is a common phenomenon experienced by survivors of sexual violence, as well as truth and reconciliation commissions have to do this in societies where there has been terrible violence, where people are oftentimes left having to negotiate with their neighbors. Rwanda is the most famous case. And those survivors of the genocide had to simultaneously process what happened to them and let it go for the benefit of a larger society. And she describes this as a very painful feeling of this kind of ethical loneliness. We'll come back to that because it's been widespread for the Jewish people since October 7th. Not only did somebody do something bad to me, but nobody believes me. Or I otherwise feel alone in my pain. That is not the first triage level of pain. That's something else, something painful and something deeper. But I think the deepest level, maybe the hardest, what happens when someone has done something to you that you feel you did not deserve, is that sometimes what can happen is you feel a loss of agency because your behavior, your feelings, have now been taken captive by what that person did to you. They take over your mind a little bit. And there can be a lot of resentment. Why am I still responding to this trigger that was invited by somebody else? I'm going to give you a banal example from my own life. A few years ago, I was sitting in my office, and it was a stressful day. And sometimes, my wife and I have really busy jobs. Sometimes, we forget to do things. It's like a normal thing. Like, when you miss a bill, right? Because I travel all the time. My wife is the head of a Jewish day school. The kids are raising themselves, right? So, things fall between the cracks. And I was stressed out, and I got a call from somebody, and he told me that he was from the power company, that we hadn't paid our bill, and they were coming to shut off the power. And this was, I think, 2 days before a Yontif. I was like, this is a disaster. And it turns out I was defrauded by somebody and I wound up paying a lot of money to this person, doing things that when I now say it out loud, I'm like, I know you're not supposed to do that. Like Venmo somebody who claims that they work in the power company. So I'm confessing that now because I know I was an idiot. I'm confessing it now. That's not how I felt for about 2 weeks. Now, fortunately, this is a low-stakes example because we can survive financially that situation, although there are a lot of people who wouldn't have been able to. If you're destitute and somebody defrauds you out of a couple of $1,000s, you can really spiral. But I think back, not about what happened, but I think back a lot, and I've thought about it a lot since, about the way that it got into my head about how I feel about myself. I felt guilty. I felt ashamed. I had to call my wife and be like, you're not going to believe what happened, right? And of course, like you might be, you're like, wait, they told you to do that and you did it? So now I have guilt and I have shame and I have all of this anger and nowhere to locate it. And I didn't do anything. And now it's not just that somebody did something to me, but they have shaped my whole moral consciousness for a period of time. They kind of wormholed into my brain and took over and shaped my sense of who I was. It makes you feel scared of people when things like this happen to you. And certainly, chas v'shalom, when actual acts of violence happen to people, it can rattle you for a long time. Not just that you're scared, but it can alter your politics, right? It can make you scared of people walking down the street. It shifts your sense. All of us have that we are autonomous, free people. We shape our own vision of the world. We are complex moral thinkers. And then something can wormhole into your brain and reshape, like move the furniture around a little bit to do something to you that makes you a little bit different than who you want to be. More pressing and obvious example is that this happened to our people on October 7th. We could talk endlessly about all of the ways that this happened, all of the losses of sense of security that Israelis felt, trust in the army, which was always the thing. Politics are captured by savages. The army is a place that will keep us safe. Altered for Israelis their story that we were at the end of history. Pogroms don't happen anymore. Zionism ended that story. And then layer after layer, after October 7th, we went deeper and deeper into this wormhole as international human rights agencies can't or won't process the violence, sexual violence against men and women on October 7th, as though there's like a Jewish exception. As protests begin in America on October 8th, as Israel becomes accused of perpetrating a genocide in Gaza as early as October 10th, right? So this happens, and now I'm the perpetrator as opposed to the victim. And so many cascading ways like this kind of gaslighting in the international community, the loss of allies that so many American Jews experience, wondering why, if it's intuitive to me that I feel a sense of Jewish peoplehood, such that when my people are ravaged at a kibbutz in the south, it's the same as when there's a synagogue shooting in America. It's the same. But my neighbors don't get it. When it's domestic, when I can leverage that anger because it helps us unite about the same shared scourge, which is hatred of minorities here and problematic gun laws, then I can show up in allyship. But if I have to show up why would I show up for you? Because of something that happened to Jews 7,000 miles away, and you start thinking to yourself, they never understood who I was at all. And actually, speaking to a lot of Jewish leaders, they kind of blame themselves. Did we get this wrong? Did we fail to narrate our story about ourselves to others? And throughout this story, this experience of being victimized in ways that you don't think you deserved, throughout the story, one of the moral consequences that has happened for our people over the past year has been what I would call a moral retreat inwards. Wrestling with a set of moral questions that are invited by victimhood. What do I need to do to withstand this? So one powerful moral impulse in Jewish life, one that I embrace and advocated for throughout the weeks and months following the beginning of the war, was our obligation to retrieve that sense, that visceral sense of solidarity to other Jews when they're in a moment of crisis. That's a moral obligation right now. That our people likes to emphasize the moral visions of the prophets, where what the prophets basically did was scold other Jews for not being good Jews. Somehow we like that as Jews, and maybe because it gives us permission to scold other Jews, but that there was actually a more pressing moral instinct in that moment, which was to take care of ourselves, to take care of our people, to create community, to open the doors for the many people out there who, they don't call themselves this, but we can call them this, who are October 7th Jews, who are part of this surge in Jewish life of maybe I didn't totally get it, and now I want to I'm not going to be a big synagogue goer, but once in a while I want to show up and stand near some other Jews. Right? So those have been the moral lessons, the early moral lessons following this experience of October 7th has been a retreat inwards. Appeals to solidarity, a focus on safety, protection, and the care for ours within our community. There's a pretty deep risk with this as an enduring moral conclusion of what the Jewish people should be focused on following an experience like this. And the real moral risk, it's one that many Jewish thinkers have talked about for decades, and it is returning, is that there can be a deep and problematic self-righteousness that comes out of a morality that is rooted in victimhood and vulnerability. Victims, almost by definition, like where I started, you didn't do anything to deserve it. You are morally pristine, right? That's what victimhood and vulnerability is in many ways about. We see that very prominently on the world stage. Those who can claim the mantle of victimhood can elevate themselves morally over those they can characterize as perpetrators. It brings a kind of self-righteousness. Professor David Hartman, in probably his most well-known essay, was an essay that he wrote after the Lebanon War in 1982, where he said, is the first war that Israel was fighting that was a non-existential war, meaning a war that Israel could fight and lose, and arguably did in 1982, and it didn't result in the destruction of the state of Israel. And Hartman warned that there were going to be two impulses that were going to characterize Jewish society in Israel, that were going to shape the moral worldview of the Jewish people, and he called them, unfairly, Auschwitz or Sinai. He said, if we are the people of Auschwitz, and by the way, we earned the status of the people of Auschwitz. If we are the people of Auschwitz exclusively, we have no moral obligations in the world besides survival itself. That's it. If we are the people of Sinai, we are holding ourselves to a set of covenantal commitments that say you only survive in order to do the work of the covenant, to bring God's presence into the world, to bring out truth and righteousness and justice, the promises that God made to Abraham that got codified in the covenant at Sinai. And Hartman challenged the Israeli people. If we remain the people who are the Jews of Auschwitz, we can survive at all costs, and we will completely erode our moral sensibilities of how we're supposed to act in the world. Now, Hartman had a little bit of a blind spot about this. He was so worried about the Judaism of Auschwitz that he didn't make room for it. October 7th brought it back. But what happens when it becomes the sum total of our Jewish ethics? What happens to us as a people when we can't talk about what we wish would happen in the world? We can only talk about how to survive in a world that also has this kind of violence and vulnerability. Another example to this effect, which really brings it home. Former Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court, Aharon Barak, wrote an extraordinary law review article, I believe in the Yale Law Review, in the year 2001. In the heyday of it came out in 2002, he wrote in 2001, in the midst of the war, of the birth of the war on terror, after 9/11. He offers a very trenchant analysis of what terrorism does to societies. Terrorism does two things, apropos my layers at the beginning. It makes us scared of what the terrorists are going to do to us, and then it actually erodes our commitments to those very civil liberties and therefore the society itself that terrorists are trying to destroy. This happened in America. It's called the Patriot Act. And there were deep consequences, actually, to American society because of the Patriot Act. It happens anywhere there is a society where terror inflicts this kind of violence. It is so scary, it is so dramatic, that we not only commit to fighting it, we wind up being so nervous about the freedoms that made possible this violence against us that we start to curtail those freedoms. That's the legal expression of the same Auschwitz or Sinai concern that Hartman was articulating. If we, as the Jewish people, have a moral vision for the world, but we take all of our time worrying about what they're doing to us, we have now suffered twice. We have been victimized in our bodies, and we have lost our moral agency of what we want to be pursuing in the world. I felt this personally in the months following October 7th. I actually felt it was a perfectly legitimate set of moral positions that we had to undertake, rabbis and community leaders and scholars at the Hartman Institute and elsewhere, to hold our people through this period of time, to affirm that we are together, that it was actually a morally essential position. I wrote this in the foreword on October 12th or 13th, that it's a morally essential position to sometimes declare that a war is just, that it's not true, as sometimes got imposed by Western Christendom on the rest of us, that any form of retaliation when you are victimized is wrong. That's Jesus's turn your other cheek mentality. We didn't sign up for that. By the way, Christendom believed it, but never held itself to it. We Jews have an incredible, different moral tradition which says, Haba lehorgecha hashkem lehorgo. If somebody's going to try to kill you, preemptively kill him. We have a whole bunch of lifeboat ethics in the Talmud that describe that you are actually obligated to save your life, even if it comes at the cost of another, because our tradition says, v'chai bahem. You are supposed to live by these principles and not die for them. There is a moral legitimacy in fighting a war when you have to fight it. There is moral legitimacy of standing in solidarity with your people when your people are being threatened. I felt that was all a plausible moral position. But increasingly I feel, especially as we hit this major milestone of 1 year, that they are limited moral positions. They are a trap. And it's almost like a wormhole in our brain. They made us scared, and now we are scared. And that one of the acts of agency that we of the Jewish people have to commit to is to figure out a way out of this wormhole. I want to consider one terrible consequence for American Jews if we don't get out of this. American Jews thrived in this country on the basis of an incredible covenant that we built implicitly between Jewish values and American values. Right? We created, the reason why most Jews in America walk around as proud liberal Jews and proud liberal Americans is because for most of us, there's no cognitive dissonance between what we consider Judaism and Americanness. And you know what we did in that period of time? We, instead of talking about victimhood and vulnerability, we American Jews built the liberal infrastructure of this country in ways that aligned between our Jewish values and modeled those values as a way to create American liberalism. That was us. That's Emma Lazarus. That's Horace Callan. That's Louis Brandeis. These are major American figures, Jews, who excavated Jewish values to make the liberal project work. What happens when the it's not working for Jews anymore? It's starting to look that way. That the liberal project isn't working for Jews anymore. By the way, one good example to this effect is that liberalism tends to believe in institutions. Institutions, trust in institutions, upholds the liberal project. In the middle of the 20th century, the three key institutions that were the pillars of American liberalism and were ultimately good for the Jews were a free and trustworthy independent press, check, not working. Nonpartisan government institutions, like the Supreme Court. How are we doing on that? And the third, the big one, the universities. We operated through those institutions to emerge as we did in America. And what I fear is that when we enter into a mindset of victimhood and vulnerability, we not only will be fearful that those institutions are disappearing from us, but we will turn their disappearance into a self-fulfilling prophecy. We will stop advocating for the moral and political vision we have for ourselves and our future, and we will ultimately participate in their regression. In Israel, if we let go of all of that passion, I spoke to a few of you before about this, all of the passion that was animating the pro-democracy judicial reforms that went until the weekend of October 7th, right? Had October 7th not happened, that Saturday night probably would have been the biggest protest in Israel. If you let go of that and say, I guess democracy doesn't work, instead I'm going to focus on something else, I guarantee you democracy will not work. I want to consider three commitments, three ideas that could constitute the next moral agenda for the Jewish people following October 7th and resulting from this anniversary. And it's going to require of us an immense amount of work and a willingness to say, I'm not rejecting the trauma of my victimhood. I am just not letting it take capture of my brain all the time. I want to suggest three. The first, here. Let's talk briefly about America. It's reasonable to be anxious, to say the least. It's reasonable to be anxious. You know, the last time that American Jews experienced as much anti-Semitism in the Ivy League as we do now, right? And by the way, I don't really think the Ivy League matters as much as the Ivy League thinks it matters. But it somehow captures people's attention because it's understood, I think wrongly, but it's understood to be a kind of measure or predictor of where America's elite institutions are going to be. I don't think that's accurate. I can tell you when I was a Columbia undergraduate, people were really, really concerned about things like things that they perceived as major injustices at the time. And then those same people, by the time senior year came around, were getting dressed up to go to their Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley interviews. And suddenly, within a few years, it wasn't that important anymore, right? So there's something about the heat and passion of being 18 to 22 in the greenhouse conditions which are a university where the most ideological people, the professors, never leave. There's something about that. But let's say we look back at a moment when anti-Semitism was very significant in the Ivy League, so much so that there were quotas. Do you know how American Jews responded to that? They didn't do what some thinkers are arguing we do, which is leave the Ivy League and we should move all Jews to, state schools in the South, right? That actually was argued. Bret Stephens wrote that in the New York Times. What they did was they fought like hell for the Ivy Leagues, invested immensely in trying to demonstrate we are here, we belong here, and we are going to hold these institutions accountable to be the institutions that we are supposed to be, or that they are supposed to be. Our defensive strategy right now is trying to protect Jews in these environments, focusing more, I know this is a complicated thing to say, so I'm going to say it, then I'm going to take it back, focusing more on protecting Jews through infrastructure of safety, rather than arguing for a public square that makes everybody safe and protected, is a choice born out of victimhood that is not only stripping us of our moral agency, but is ultimately going to be a preview to worse things to come. I am terrified. Jewish institutions have to be safe and secure. We have to have access to those resources. I'm really worried about if there's a zero-sum choice, the emphasis that happens through the securitization of Jewish institutions rather than the investment in liberal democracy. That's what we could be doing as American Jews. We could be holding a mirror to America and saying, our job as Jews in this country is to be part of envisioning a better future, a better, healthier America in which Jews will ultimately flourish and be safe. Which of those impulses are we going to be drawn to oftentimes is shaped by whether we feel we are stuck in a period of victimhood and vulnerability, or we feel that we are called to be a people of Sinai. The second, which is for Israel. If the first here is an investment in pluralism and liberal democracy, those hallmarks of Jewish life, in Israel, we as American Jews must partner with Israelis on reconfiguring and reanimating a moral conversation about Israel's future. Israelis have no trouble whatsoever hating their government and serving in the army. Hating their government, right, and expressing their loyalty. You know what was the most amazing thing about the Israeli protest movement for those 10 months? The Israeli left and center won the flag. They won the flag. American left gave up the flag. They lost the flag during Vietnam, right? So now somebody puts up a flag, they're probably right of center. The flag is a marker of a kind of patriotism which puts liberals on the defensive, because now someone else has like a shortcut to being a good patriot. The Israeli left and center won the flag. So much so, this was this amazing story. Last year on Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day in May 2023, there was a town, a municipality, that was putting up flags for Israel Independence Day, and people were taking them down because they understood them to be the political statement by the left. Think about how crazy that is. So they won the flag for what patriotism looks like. And this has always been the case. You are not less of a patriot by being a dissident to your government. You are more of a patriot because you're showing that you love your country more than you necessarily love the political expression of its leadership. There is so much stuff right now in Israel, under the surface, largely held captive by a right-wing government that does not want to engage in those issues. There is so much energy that is eager for moral vision and transformation of Israeli society. We, as American Jews, have to be partners with that. We have to speak that language, and that's not only to be able to hold up those voices in Israel, it's also to be able to win the ideas debate here. One of the things that is devastating to me about Zionism in the American Jewish community is that we, as a community, talk much more about protection and defense and fear, holding up the mantle of Zionism. And ironically, problematically, the people talking about justice and righteousness are in the anti-Zionist camp. Are we telling on ourselves? Are we saying Zionism doesn't manifest those values? Look how much terrain we're yielding in what it means to actually be a Zionist. So even in the case where I say I think the war is legitimate, even in the case where I think solidarity is legitimate, can't I make room for more? Can't I make room for, I want, at the same time, it's an easy one. At the same time that I want Israel to defeat Hamas, I am going to passionately argue as often as I can that Israel needs a parallel diplomatic strategy with the Palestinian people in the recognition that there is no military solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is no military solution, that Israelis and Palestinians are, like it or not, stuck with one another in perpetuity, and that in the long run, the safety and security of Jews and the safety and security of Palestinians are inextricably intertwined. Why can't we say that? It's actually kind of more exciting to talk about a vision for a future that we want to commit to, as opposed to constricting our conversation about Zionism exclusively to the protective. I believe in liberal Zionism. Some of my colleagues tell me, Yehuda, it's a bad, Zionism, bad brand. We need another word. I don't believe in that thing. That's not true. Ideologies can be losing for a long time until they win. So forget about whether it's a good or bad brand. But I fear that this liberal Zionist position, which, by the way, characterizes the majority of American Jews, certainly in Reform and conservative congregations, even if they don't know it as an ideology, but they basically feel that Israel is really important to being a Jew. They feel committed to its safety and its survival, and they think that the religious pluralism issue is a major issue in Israel. They shouldn't feel that Israel is the one place where they can't be a Jew. And they're really worried about occupation. So put that together, that's kind of liberal Zionism. We can't be the people who hedge. We can't be the, well, this, but that. We can't be the people who speak less passionately about our views than either the anti-Zionist left or the illiberal Zionist right. Those people speak with a lot of conviction and a lot of certainty, and they deploy moral language. The next step for us is to figure out how, even after October 7th, we reclaim the capacity for a moral vision for our understanding of Zionism here and for the future of Jewish life in Israel. And the third big commitment I want us to consider is what happens to our community and to ideas about being an open tent, which we like to think that we are more than we are. What happens to those ideas after a year of so much boundary drawing between those who we think said the right thing about Israel and those who didn't? How do we rebuild our Jewish institutions to once again be places of inclusivity and pluralism? Now, let's be honest. There are a whole bunch of people post-October 7th who decided, I no longer want to be connected to the Jewish community in those institutions. I say this actually with generosity. I wish them well in creating their own institutions. They're going to need them. They're going to need places to daven. They're going to need Shabbat community. And if they don't want to be part of our synagogues and institutions anymore, that's fine. But the majority of the people are not that. A lot of people are in the middle. Some people showed up for the first time after October 7th. Are we actually going to be able to absorb those folks? We were happy that they came. Do we have the strength, the resilience, the openness to actually hold them in? And what about those people who didn't leave fully, but they're angry at what they consider to be the wrong politics of the Jewish community? What about those people who are our family members who are upset? Are we prepared to take a next step in saying, we know we experienced a trauma. When you are in trauma mode, you divide the world between friend and foe. When we emerge from trauma, you start to recognize that there's friend, there's foe, and there's a third thing, which is a lot of people who you may just have complicated relationships with. In Kol Nidre, we're going to say an amazing line in Kol Nidre, which gets kind of passed by because people kind of come in a few minutes late and you're a little like frenzied, and then you got to go pee because you drank too much water right before you came. There's a line right at the beginning of the Kol Nidre service which says, we give ourselves permission in this service to pray with the sinners. It's a funny line to say for a few reasons, one of which is we're saying Kol Nidre, where we're letting go of all of our grudges and our promises, but we're being honest about the fact that we still got a lot of problems with other people in the congregation. We know we're not as good at letting go of things. Now, there's an incredible history of where this prayer came from. It probably originates in post-Inquisition Jewish communities when a whole bunch of Jews became Christian for the purposes of avoiding persecution, and then after that period of time, went back to their synagogues. And can you imagine what it must have felt like for the Jews who stayed Jewish all along? When those people came back, their impulse was, you were not with us in our time of need. You picked the easy way out. And so the liturgy takes a deep breath and says, we give ourselves permission to pray with sinners. if we were honest with ourselves, I challenge you to do this at Kol Nidre. Look around, find the people you think are wrong, dangerously wrong, and just whisper these words to them yourself. It's an activity of self-correction. I actually if you want Jewish community, you're going to have to stretch a little bit to make possible that inclusion. We have a choice, right? In a period that feels so traumatic, to be stuck in the tribal mentality of friend or foe, or to shift to something a little bit different. I started off with the idea of agency, right? What happens to us oftentimes not only is something that happens to us, but it inhibits our sense that we are fully in control of our choices. As an institutional leader in the Jewish community, I felt this after October 7th. There were pieces of our work as an organization I paused because I felt I don't have a clear enough mindset to keep pursuing this complicated piece of work in a moment like this, and I didn't want to hurt the work by engaging with it so emotionally. I think it was very legitimate that our moral instincts following October 7th oftentimes were, and I spoke about this endlessly, were around what does solidarity entail and what does solidarity demand. I fear that we might be at a risk of losing our agency, being able to shape this story, and I'm really worried for a Jewish community that thinks that our moral vision is the thing that has carried us through history, feeling as though we can't make room for a moral conversation even amidst all of this horror. Jewish instincts sometimes pull against this. If you believed that October 7th was a pogrom, you heard that phrase people were tossing around? Most Jews killed in one day since the Holocaust. Maybe this is like a pogrom again. The word pogrom evokes something diasporic. It undermines the very story Zionism told about itself. The Kishinev pogrom, in fact, was the catalytic moment for many, many Jews in Europe and outside of Europe, even the United States, to say we need a different solution to this problem. And we need Zionism. To reawaken the language of pogrom is to push us back into Jewish history, which has fewer moral choices. Medieval and early modern Jews didn't have to talk about the morality of how to exercise power because we didn't have any. Right? You get to be purely in a moral conversation of safety and survival. You get to be pristine, right? Without the moral challenges of statecraft. The same thing is happening right now. When we talk about anti-Semitism in America, and people use phrases like, this is reminiscent of 1931 Germany. You know what you say when you're saying that? You're saying that I am on a unstoppable flow of history that I am powerless to change. Here's the amazing thing about October 7th that makes it unlike any other pogrom in Jewish history. The thing about October 7th that makes it unlike any other pogrom in Jewish history is that no Jews in history had October 8th. No Jews in Jewish history had an army capable of responding. No Jews in Jewish history had lawyers like Tal Becker, my colleague at Hartman, who, when we are accused by others of an anti-Semitic libel, can actually stand up and eloquently argue back in the family of nations against this accusation. No Jews in Jewish history had the kind of political power and presence that American Jews have in America. Our capitulation to a narrative of inevitability around our suffering is an old diasporic story, wildly inconsistent with the realities we have in the present. Pessimism for Jews is self-fulfilling. It's tempting. Pessimism is never falsifiable. You know why? It can always get worse. Actually, it's the opposite that is the harder piece of work. The willingness to stand, as the Israelites did, under a mountain in the desert and commit themselves to building a moral civilization in spite of the fact that they'd never seen it, in spite of the fact that we were emerging out of a slave consciousness. That's what Hartman means by a Sinai consciousness, even in a moment right on the tails of immense suffering. I say this all the time. We as Jews do not get to choose the era of Jewish history into which we are born. You do not get to choose the era of Jewish history into which we are born. The only thing we as Jews can do is to determine what kind of Jews we want to be based on the era in which we're born. We have experienced immense trauma as our people. It has been a wormhole in our brain. I think maybe as we begin the transition to our life after the commemoration of October 7th, it's time to reawaken a Jewish moral conversation. Thank you. Thank you. You may take some questions. Okay. Great. We have a microphone for people who want to ask questions. The microphone going to pass around, or we have people in the back with the microphone. Okay, so please.
Yes. So I want Yehuda, thank you very, very much for a very, very informative, I'm trying to find the right words, informative, thought-provoking presentation tonight. It's a lot to think about about how we really walk forward, I think, into the future as 21st century Jews post-October 7th. It's really meaningful. Thank you so much. And now we will open up to questions. I'm going to give the floor first to Rick Berkman.
I guess that's fair.
Thank you, Dr. Kurtzer. It is amazing how you can make us reflect on this. So I'm going to pose a related question. Historically, Zionism arose as a secular movement to find a new way out of the 2,000-year history of diaspora that was powerless. And the historical, even liberal Zionism in its founding, had a bias against diaspora. It wanted to set aside the history of diaspora. As Israel evolves, and hopefully with your help finds a new definition of modern liberal Zionism, how can we help them change this cultural bias and recognize that if they want to be part of, they want American Jews to be part of Israel and the Jewish people, they have to acknowledge that maybe we contributed something to that 2,000-year survival.
Yeah.
And maybe we have a role to play going forward as their partners without having to make aliyah.
Yeah.
So how do we help change that anti-diaspora bias of the Israeli ethos?
Wonderful. So first of all, there's parts of that are not going to change. And we're going to have to just love Israelis for their blind spots. And part of the reason that's a hard thing for Israelis to change is because, as you indicated, baked into the Zionist project was a belief of the state of Israel as kind of an end to history. It's the Zionist version of the repair of the problem that Jews had in the West. And to believe that, like, this is deeply in Herzl writes about this based on another Eastern European Jewish thinker, Leo Pinsker, that it's not going to work to assimilate Jews into the West. Jews are too much, according to these Zionist thinkers, are too much the kind of antithesis of the West. The identity of the West is built on a negative image, which is Jewishness. So for those thinkers who have a huge impact on Zionism, and for many Jews who left Europe on the basis of persecution, Israel is the antidote to that problem. And as a result, for many Israelis, including some politicians, when anti-Semitism appears in the diaspora, they are sad, but they're not surprised. And actually, they feel affirmed. You thought you were going to make this work. It's not going to work. It's very, very hard to disabuse people of something that is actually critical to their formational identity. It's going to be very hard for us as American Jews to convince Israelis that they are wrong about the very thing that they think constitutes their Zionism. The best we can do is to start opening them up to a different possibility and a different story of Jewish history. In my work, I I find myself now more and more with Israeli audiences. This is what I do. I tell them a different story about the Jewish people in the last 120 years. Tell them a story in which their assumption, even the learned and liberal types, their assumption is that diasporic Jewish identity is just that. It is diasporic. It's basically the same. American Jewry in 2024 is the same as like French Jewry in the 1750s. It's just like a slightly different version of the same thing, but it always ends badly. So the telos of history is the arrival of Zionists into the land of Israel. And the best I can get them to is a place of what would happen if you held up a different Jewish story alongside yours. Must you lose in order to accept another narrative? On a one-to-one basis, this works. Question is just, how do we get to scale? Every time Israelis spend time in North American Jewish communities, actually quite a few Israelis were in American Jewish communities this year, getting out of Israel for a variety of reasons. Many of them will stay, but a lot of them went back. Every single time that happens, when our community welcomes them with open arms, shows them the majesty of a Jewish day school, shows them a synagogue that doesn't look like what their boogeyman image of what a synagogue and a rabbi look like. Every single time that happens, you've awakened a consciousness of maybe there's something else there. This is just hard, and it's iterative and it's slow. And by the way, there's things we as diaspora Jews can learn from that story of Jewish history, one that actually feels foreign to us. I think it is okay for us as Jews to be able to say, there are two great plausible theories of Jewish history being played out in front of us. The American Jewish theory, which believes that liberal democracy can be great for the Jews, the Israeli Jewish theory that thinks that the West is not a place where Jews can live. They've been at blood sport with each other. What does it look like for us to say they are like Hillel and Shammai in the rabbinic Beit Midrash? Two powerful, enduring ideas, and that I learned something from seeing them in dynamic tension with each other. I think there's a hand right here.
Please stand, we're going to get a microphone.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your discussion of moral issues, of ethical issues. I have a very kind of practical question. Many of us engage with family members, colleagues, neighbors that are on the other side, basically now. So there's a rift, a significant rift. And it's becoming harder and harder to talk to these people. I said, these people, look at that. These people, these are my. So what's the advice? You know, how do you engage with somebody who is in an Ivy League school and is on the other side, basically?
Look, I said,
Well, yeah, you know,
Yeah.
the other side,
Practice.
that's the issue.
whatever side is not yours.
So somebody who's extremely pro-Palestinian, and it's chanting from the river to the sea, and they are my colleagues, my students, you know, my neighbors, and it's very hard to talk to them.
So, first of all, time and place, right? When someone is screaming at a protest, it is neither the time nor the place. That I think is that is actually an important insight, to know when you have the space to do that. The second is to understand what is the relationship. So there's a big difference between a colleague or a peer at an institution versus your children or your grandchildren, where I'm seeing it very painfully, where relationships are being severed by politics, and it's not worth it. It's not worth it. Now, we happen to have some technologies built into the American liturgical calendar and the Jewish liturgical calendar, which are holidays designed to force you to sit for long meals together with people you think are wrong. The American version is called Thanksgiving, and the Jewish version is called Pesach, right? What's the worst that can happen? You argue, you fight, right? You actually take the plot of the Pesach on liberation and talk about different visions of liberation. And you can be convinced that the person who's using that story in a way that you feel is being weaponized against the Jewish people, that they're doing it wrong. And then, if they're your children or your grandchildren, you give them a kiss on the forehead when they leave, and you send them home with leftovers. That's what I mean by some amount of stretching to try to build an inclusive vision of a community that we need and that we want, and some amount of discomfort. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to necessarily capitulate on the things that we believe and hold on to. In order to not capitulate, that's partly why I'm talking about the reclaiming of a moral language, because I got to tell you, if somebody is speaking a moral language and you're speaking a protective language, you're going to lose that fight. Right? But if we start to figure out how to narrate our story more effectively, speak with a moral language about our convictions, then at least we've created some semblance of balance. I don't think this is going to happen quickly. I don't think that relationships in faculty departments are going to be repaired all that quickly. But I also don't want to make it self-fulfilling that we completely check out of those stories, right? That we decide these relationships are not worth fighting, and the public conversation is not worth fighting for. So I go back to time and place. And I know that's not a perfect answer. I know it's not a solution, but I think if we want to achieve either reconciliation or even winning, we don't have a choice. David Hartman, again, has this great line in an article he writes about pluralism. He had a lot of different theories as to why we should be pluralistic, but this is my favorite. He says, if I don't talk to people who disagree with me, how can I convince them that they're wrong? I think there's something to that.
I'm going to jump in and just make a plug for all of our congregants, for those that are members of Congregation Bread of Shalom, on October 6th, Sunday, October 6th, and you can see this in your info, led by one of our amazing past presidents, Fred Strober, as well as leaders of both our Israel Connectors and our Israel-Palestine discussion group. We're going to have an opportunity to do this, to listen to each other, to talk to each other. We're not actually going to be going over, trying to convince. It's really just to learn and listen. It'll be facilitated, and I invite you all to look out for that and to join us for that opportunity to try this, at least within our congregation, so we can have a place of dialogue and connection.
Great. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. As usual.
The microphone's going to come up.
Thank you. Thank you very much, as usual, thoughtful and insightful. Here's my question. What about approaching people who are rah-rah pro-Palestinian and asking them, okay, I understand that you're sympathetic politically. What else do you know about the values of this culture? What else do you know about the values of this culture? And
I feel that's a loaded question.
It is. But I'm saying I want to say it politely, and I don't want to attack the person that I'm asking. But the question, or the perspective behind that question is, do you really know what you're supporting in its totality, or larger than just the political?
I want to say that question is going to get you in a lot of trouble, because we don't know fully the totality of what, if you are on the other side of that position, you also don't know fully what the totality is of what you're supporting. I mean, we've had to watch, underreported in Jewish media over the past year has been the hundreds of violent incidents committed by settlers in the West Bank against innocent Palestinian civilians. Another hard thing. I can believe, for instance, that the State of Israel's war against Hamas has been just, has been extraordinarily well fought on a lot of different fronts, and it is not an anti-Zionist position to say there have also been grievous mistakes. And the reason it's not an anti-Zionist thing to say is because the State of Israel tells us that it commits those mistakes. And we have, I think many of us, have lost our capacity for the kind of empathy that would genuinely make us feel that those mistakes are not simply accidents that happen, but they are cataclysmic consequences. Moshe Halbertal, Israeli philosopher, says we should at least have the dignity to use the phrase collateral killing instead of collateral damage. so that we take seriously that when we're doing those things, we're killing people. And we don't use that kind of language. And I would say that the place to invest in the relationships is when you know there is sincerity on the other side of the relationship. The hardest conversations I've had this year have not been here. They have been with my Palestinian colleagues in Israel, because I believe them to be, as they are, serious moral people who are watching what they believe is the destroying of their families and their culture. And the work in a moment like that is to hear it. And if I say to my colleagues, but do you know about this problem? They know about the problems in their society, believe me. But what they need me to hear is that we cannot set up a zero-sum conversation, because a zero-sum conversation leads to the kinds of politics and the kinds of aggression that believes that the only way out of this is through one side being triumphant and one side losing, and that's not going to ultimately be in the interest of the 15 million people between the river and the sea.
Hi, Brian Gordon, Road of Shalom. I wanted to share with you that we're not waiting until, at Road of Shalom, we're not waiting until October 7th to shift gears and to do a serious examination of the whole question, the history of Israel, the history of the conflict, what happened before, and especially what's going to happen afterwards. And we're arriving this, I'm one of the members of the Israel-Palestine discussion group, and we have different tracks. We have a wonderful group of Israel connectors who is very supportive of Israel and the Israeli government, and we are very questioning of it. But we're reaching the place that you're reaching, and that is ultimately we all have to get along. And Israel is a big boy, big country in a sense, that it can weather every single criticism, but ultimately it's got to learn how to Palestinians and Jews have to get along. And agreeing with you very closely is that I've advocated the idea that as American Jews, we are uniquely positioned through the prism of American constitutional law, which is really the foundation of international law. But law and the Bible, which is the foundation of law, of the Western law, to speak very strongly and firmly about right and wrong and about how we see things and to engage constructively.
Yeah, and please keep in mind, and this is really important, throughout this war, as oftentimes happens when anything relates to Israel, what happens is the direct victims of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are Israelis and Palestinians. Those are the direct victims. A secondary set of casualties occur in Jewish communal life when we go after each other. We have to know, when you're studying these differences, you're studying the conflict in a serious way, this congregation is not going to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's not. But what this congregation could do is help be a beacon of support to the people over there who are going to who are going to resolve it. And it could help to alleviate some of the casualties we incur in our own community about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by building a more resilient community that's capable of talking across difference. So, capable of talking across difference. Talking across difference, right? So we have to know that's a worthwhile agenda in its own right. And to the extent that we want to get involved in helping the players over there, I'm not sure it happens inside a congregation, but we could debate that further. I could see, based on your face, you want to debate it further. I could take,
I saw a couple of hands up that were up for a long time. Hold on, please. And also, please try to limit these. I know that this is Israel is something we all feel passionate
whatever
about.
Whatever you say,
I'd
just
like
ends
a
with like an
question.
inclination that sounds like a question mark.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very inspiring to hear what you're saying. It's like, it reminds me of Heschel and the higher plane of living that he talked about trying to achieve. But in the real world of the politics that we have, you refer to the challenges we have in the United States responding to 9/11, the Patriot Act, and the kind of difficulties we've had dealing with our own traumas here.
Yeah.
Ordinarily, you'd think America could take a leadership role and set an example for Israel, but it seems like we're blocked by our own inability to deal with the same dynamics.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you have any suggestions for how to break that down, because
No.
what could our I mean,
No,
what
I
could,
think- look, I
what
think-
could our political
yeah.
leaders contribute to
Yeah.
helping with this?
Look, part of the reason I love the Barak text so much is because it reflects a kind of awareness and self-consciousness about what happens to a society. So even studying it itself is so, you recognize your own society in it. You recognize your own biases and fears. You notice them. You start interrogating them. You name them. You learn them with others. That's the only way societies improve themselves, is when they're capable of holding up a mirror to themselves. One of the things that has buoyed me throughout this time has been watching the kinds of people who are capable of knowing what is being brought upon them and deciding anyway to commit to living lives of purpose. I'll give you one example I talk about all the time. A colleague of mine who is a professor of medieval Judaism. For the year prior to October 7th, individuals who in his spare time was organizing the Jerusalem protests against the judicial reform. After October 7th, he took the entire infrastructure of the protests against the judicial reform and he turned it into the basis for the Jerusalem Hamal, which basically means Home Front Support Unit for Jerusalem, to care for, protect families of soldiers, give people what they needed, take care of issues in the public square. When I asked him earlier in the year, like, what changed? He goes, nothing changed. The reason I have to do this is because I don't have a functional government that I believe in. So I'm taking care of my society. He's still protesting the government every Saturday night. And the wildest part is he has had, for the better part of 12 months, 3 sons in Gaza. Look at a person like that who's basically saying, I know, 3 sons fighting in Gaza. I know, I'm trying as best as I can to hold on to my conviction of what's right for the state of Israel, my patriotic obligations and loyalties to do what I need to do, my support for my family, and knowing that this experience of victimhood is probably eroding my sensibilities of my obligations to the other. I'm just going to do it. I'm going to go out and do it. So I feel like instead of looking at that problem that feels very acute, I just want to look for, like, it's like a version of Mr. Rogers' look for the helpers. It's like, look for the exemplars. Look for the exemplars. Look at those folks who are actually capable. And I look at that and I'm like, that's my Zionism. Guy like him is my Zionism. And more we elevate those kind of voices, and we've seen so many of them in Israeli society over the past terrible year, the more we get for ourselves a template of why is it so hard for me to stay resilient during this time? Let me take one more. How about that? Okay. Anyone have a great last one? Great.
Okay.
Thank you. You mentioned Israel has October 8th, or had October 8th. Sort of getting beyond Palestinians for a second, would it not be fair to say that as long as Iran is constituted as it is, with its proxies surrounding Israel armed with evil intent, that the darkest days may still be before us and the problems that we're discussing today may be intensified?
That's the Jewish optimist. It can always be worse. Yeah. Look, yes, Iran, very bad, right? Early in the war, it became clear to me that there were 7 fronts of this war, right? You had the northern front, you had the war with Hamas on the southern border, you had Iran and its proxies elsewhere in the region, you had the way that the war was coming home for American Jews here, you had emergence of immense conflict in the West Bank. I know there's only 5, there were 7, I'll go back and look. There's no question, and it's very possible, especially after today's news, you can feel excited and kind of puzzled by how the Israeli military forces, although they're not taking credit for it, managed to blow up 2,800 pagers on the body of Hezbollah operatives throughout Lebanon and feel like, great, there is immense fear in Israel today. Immense fear, messages going out across the country, clean out your safe rooms. There's immense fear, and this could go on for a long time. The existence of multiple fronts doesn't mean those fronts get fought the same way. Right? I've felt since the beginning of the war, it's a huge mistake for Israel to be fighting the war in the West Bank as though it's fighting the same war in the South. It's a huge mistake for us to militarize our issues in the American Jewish context as though we are a front equivalent to the fronts that Israel is fighting there. And in fact, the more prolonged any of these particular conflicts are, the more it is in our interest to be far more strategic in the places where we can be, as opposed to coalescing this whole thing as into one war. The more you coalesce it into one war, the more you get trapped in feeling that this is a battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. The more you wind up painting people in the middle, the confused, the neutral, as though there's no time for neutrality, everybody is complicit. The more you continue to retreat into an internal moral sensibility that makes you not see where there are places for the exercising of a different kind of moral agency. We can't let ourselves do it. And you're right to say, we're going to be in this for the long haul, right? This isn't, well, let's mark a year after October 7th and move on with our lives. If anything, that's the impetus for us to get to work in shaping the kind of Jewish people we want to be. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much. What an inspiring presentation, and what a wonderful way to kick off our 2024-25 Israel Speakers Series. Thanks again for coming. If you would like to support future quality programming like tonight, there is a contribution basket in the back of the room, actually, I think on two sides of the room. Thank you, Vanna. and please, we would appreciate your contributions. Thanks again for coming. Drive home safely.